Hello and welcome to everyone for the 9th and final class in the Library of Michigan's Digitization Basics webinar series. This is Digital Asset Management Part 2, Preservation, Fixity, and Storage. I'm Biz Gallo, the Statewide Digitization Initiatives Coordinator, and I am joined today by Dr. Chelsea Denault from the Michigan Digital Preservation Network. So thank you so much for joining us, Chelsea.
You bet. Thanks, Biz.
For those of you who don't know me, my job is to help libraries and cultural heritage organizations around the state digitize their material, to preserve it, and to make it accessible. So in order to prepare the state to do so, we've created this 9-part series that will lay the foundation for digitizing your collections and making them accessible. So you can see, I'm working off of 2 different systems right now, so we'll get this by the end, promise. So you can see the other parts in the series here. And after this series, which is ending after this class, we'll be looking at some of the other topics in digitization. So there's going to be some format specific classes such as digitizing newspapers, scrapbooks, or audiovisual material. There's going to be some resource centered classes such as writing a digitization grant, applying for grants, and creating digital exhibits. And then there will be procedural classes like creating digital exhibits. There will be also a short poll at the end of today's class to help guide digitization programming going forward. So I hope you'll stick around to the end so you can provide your feedback. And then in addition to the Digitization Basics webinar series, we've been developing a niche academy module based on the material covered in this series. And if you take these classes, you can hone your skills and learn about digitization in new ways. And in the end, you can earn a badge. So Becky's going to go ahead and drop the link in the chat so you can explore that module. Okay, just a couple other things. I'd like to go over a bit of housekeeping first. This webinar is being recorded, so you can access the content again later, along with a copy of the slides. Now, this recording should be available in about a week, leaving time for captioning. If you have questions, feel free to drop them in the chat throughout, but there will definitely be time for Q&A at the end. If you have any technical issues, you can reach out to Becky in the chat and she can help you resolve them. So if you have any audio issues or anything like that. And then finally, there are many additional resources on the Library of Michigan's digitization page, so please feel free to explore that. Today, we're going to be covering what is digital preservation and, more importantly, why it's important, managing our digital files, and then we'll go over some tools and resources for digital preservation. But for those of you who've been with us in the other classes, I always like to start off with a poll. So Becky, if you want to go ahead and launch the poll, we're going to ask, what is your level of familiarity with digital preservation? Would you consider yourself very familiar? Like you're a digital preservation pro, you're somewhat familiar, you know what it is, you know what you should be doing and you're working towards it. You're not very familiar, you may have heard the term, but you don't really know what you should be doing, or you're not familiar at all. What's digital preservation? What am I supposed to be doing? So take a second and just kind of key in your answers so we can get a baseline for where people are. Okay. Looks like mostly everyone has submitted their level, and I'm excited. I mean, for that one who is a digital preservation pro, I'm not sure if that's Chelsea, if you responded to this, but if it's not, great. We would love you to also include some notes. But it looks like most people are somewhat familiar. You know what you should be doing, but you maybe need some more guidance or help on tools or resources. Looks like a handful of people are not very familiar and they've heard the term, and that's great. You're in the right place because today we're going to be going over a lot of that and at least get you off on a good start to know basics that you should be doing and tools that you can use to help get you where you need to be. So I'm going to go ahead and hit close out of that. And we'll to hand it over to Chelsea. So it's all you.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Biz. And yes, I did choose Digital Preservation Pro. I feel like if I didn't, like, why am I running this show here? Except I'm not running the show. You're running the show. I'm just along for the ride. So welcome, everyone. We are going to start off by talking about what is digital preservation, and then we'll move into talking about why it's important. So Biz, if you want to go to the next slide. Thank you. So what are we talking about? I always like to share my favorite definition of digital preservation, which comes to us from the Digital Preservation Handbook from the Digital Preservation Coalition. And there is a link right there, and we will talk more about this handbook in part 3. But the definition is digital preservation is the series of managed activities necessary to ensure continued access to digital materials for as long as necessary. So let's unpack this definition a little bit because it's small, but there's a lot going on there. So let's start with series of managed activities. This is the most important part because it tells us that digital preservation requires a variety of actions to be done and that we need to be proactive and systematic about how we approach those actions. Also, this infers that digital preservation is an ongoing process and not just a one-off activity. Continued access. This reminds us that the ultimate aim of digital preservation is maintaining access to, and even more so, continued use of our digital materials. And then finally, as long as necessary. This is a reminder that we should be aiming to preserve digital content for as long as it's needed, which will depend on your organizational use. It may be a few years, for things like bank statements or payroll records, but it also may mean in perpetuity, which is often the case for cultural memory materials. Next slide, Biz. Another way that we like to think about how digital preservation interacts with the other things that you've been talking about in your wonderful webinar series is the three-legged stool. So throughout this series, you've learned that digitization without access is incomplete. Likewise, digitization without preservation is incomplete. Any successful digitization project will need to plan for providing access to and preservation of its digital files throughout the entire life cycle. And a way to visualize this concept is the three-legged stool, each leg supporting its own facet of digital collections, digitization, access, and preservation. And without one leg, the stool, of course, falls over, which doesn't make it a very useful stool. Next slide, Biz. So before we start getting into how we keep digital materials safe and why it's important, let's talk a little bit about what is a digital object. So all digital objects, even the most complex, are essentially different configurations of binary code or a series of ones and zeros. 1 byte is made up of 8 bits, such as the combination you see there. And a byte is the basic unit we use for describing storage. So for example, 124 bytes equals 1 kilobyte. And next slide, Biz. And at its most basic level, digital preservation is often called bit level preservation. In this sense, our goal as preservationists is to keep every bit, every single 1 and 0 in every individual byte in the same place for perpetuity. And this is because as digital files sit, the electromagnetic charge that's used for encoding those bits can decay, leading from a bit to flip from a 1 to a 0 or vice versa. And such a small change might not matter in an analog world, right, with paper or film, but right, if a paper starts to yellow slightly, we can still read what's there. But with bit rot and data decay, this can result in total data loss, which is why bit level fixity is the most essential goal for the preservation of digital objects. And we can see this in action in this image here, right? 0 bits flipped. We see that the image is correct. It has its integrity. It has its authenticity. In the second image, only 1 bit has flipped. And we can see that the quality of the image continues to degrade into 2 bits flipped, 3 bits flipped. So you can see visually how much data is lost by a single bit flip. Next slide, Biz. So why should you care about digital preservation? There's really 2 reasons. And the first reason is risk. And risk for digital objects comes in a couple of different flavors. The first is obsolescence, or the inability to use or support the hardware and software we need to access digital materials. Hardware obsolescence is, I think, the type that we're most familiar with. It has a lot to do with the actual media that our digital content is stored on. Software obsolescence focuses more on the software and programs needed to open and use digital content, especially proprietary formats. Natural disasters, of course. This can include wildfires, tornadoes, earthquakes, and floods, which we are becoming even more familiar with here in Michigan as weather patterns are impacted by human-caused climate change. And it's also important to note that sometimes the secondary result of these natural disasters, such as power outages, can have even bigger impacts on our digital collection storage. Intentional attacks by malicious actors or ransomware. Over the past few years, these attacks in which individuals or groups prevent you from accessing your computer files, systems, or networks, and then demands you pay a ransom for the return, have been on the rise in cultural memory organizations and local governments. And digital preservation is a great defense strategy to combat these actions. And then finally, what we have just discussed, digital degradation, or what we commonly refer to as bit rot. Digital content is, as we saw in the previous slide, actually very fragile and easily degrades over time. And as it degrades, it can have some substantial impacts on the usability or quality of our content. And as I said, we call this sort of degradation bit rot. And ultimately, digital preservation is a sort of insurance policy to protect your content, as well as the staff time and financial cost you invested in creating them, which is a great transition to our next slide about why you should care: costs. There's a couple of different costs to keeping the integrity of our digital content. And these costs fall into 2 categories, tangible and intangible. Tangible costs represent the monetary investment an organization has made into stewarding and creating physical and then digital materials. So things like storing and caring for the physical items that we might be making digital copies of. Digitization equipment and software, digital storage space, the staff time that we've put into creating and digitizing materials. As well as any legal challenges that we might have to deal with. The intangible costs are slightly different. They don't represent a monetary cost, but more of a reputational or mission-based cost. And they include, first and foremost, the loss of unique historical content and the people that content represents. Losing historical content that has been given to us to steward is simply a failure of our mission as cultural memory organizations. And we should make every effort to care for our materials and the stories they represent. Second is the political or social fallout that might come from our losses. If a donor or a donor's family asks to see some content that they had donated, or if the local news was to find out that some of our materials had been lost, there is a very real reputational cost that our organizations can take in losing the trust of our community. And then finally, any legal issues that might stem from this lack of stewardship can also have a reputational cost to our organizations. And with that, I think I will pass it on to Biz for our next section.
Great. Well, we're going to skip right ahead to keeping stuff safe. And how do we do that? How do we keep our content safe? So, as Chelsea mentioned, digital preservation is the series of managed activities necessary to ensure continued access to digital materials for as long as necessary. But what do we mean when we're talking about those managed activities? Like, what specifically are we talking about? So the most basic and the most important activities that you can do to digitally preserve your material are file identification and validation, fixity checking, file distribution, and migration and emulation. So we're going to look at these a little bit more closely now. So in order to preserve something, we need to understand what it is that we're preserving. And this is where file identification comes in. File identification, which is sometimes known as file characterization, is gathering and noting information about different types of files in a collection. And this is important because it helps us plan for maintaining our collections. It helps us know how much storage we're going to need. It helps us identify particular access environment requirements and plan for obsolescence and so much more. So for example, if we know we have a certain file type in our collection that can only be accessed through software on one computer, we know we'll need to maintain that machine in order to continue providing access to that file, for now at least. And if we know we have files in a certain format that's on the verge of obsolescence, because normally it's not a switch, it's steps that lead us towards something, and we can plan for that sort of obsolescence. That way we know we're going to have to take steps to migrate those to a file format that is not obsolete, and we'll talk about that in a minute as well. So next is file validation. And file validation is the process of checking that a file conforms to a file format specification. And you'll remember from earlier classes that file formats are sets of structural conventions that define a wrapper, formatted data, and embedded metadata. And that can be followed to represent images, audiovisual material, textual documents, and more. So validation is the process of verifying that the file conforms to that set of documents that specify standards for the file format. And this could be for the file itself, or it could be for metadata about that object. So a sidecar XML file, for example. And unvalidated files can still be digitally preserved, but it might be more difficult. There might be additional steps. You might have to do a lot more troubleshooting or discovery later on to be able to continue to digitally preserve or provide access to that. So it's great to try and plan for future work now and set yourself up for success, so that later you're not trying to have to find out what something was and did something go wrong in storage, or did we get it like this? So luckily, we don't have to do any of that work on our own, or we don't have to do a lot of that work on our own. There's some very useful tools that are available to us to not only help with the file identification process, but also file validation. So there's many open source tools available, especially there's Jove and Droid, and Chelsea is going to talk about these later on, but there are definitely tools and resources available to help you with these tasks. So now that we know what we have, how do we know that we still have it tomorrow or next month or next year? We do this by fixity checking. So fixity checking is the property, fixity is the property of being unchanged. And fixity checking is verifying that something has remained unchanged. So Chelsea just talked about the bits, the ones and zeros that make up a digital object, and making sure that if it's 1001, blah, blah, that it's still that when you check it the next time. So this is often referred to as integrity checking or hashing, and it's one of the most important actions we can take to protect the individual bits in our digital content. So we ensure fixity by the creation and validation of checksums. And checksums are strings of numbers and letters that are unique to that particular digital object and to that arrangement of bits. So that arrangement of ones and zeros, if that arrangement doesn't change, that checksum will always be the same. So checksums can be created using a variety of different algorithms, and there's reasons for the different algorithms based on different levels of security and complexity. But the most common that you're going to encounter are MD5 checksums, SHA-1, or SHA-256. And cultural heritage organizations, MD5 checksums are totally sufficient for our needs. So you can also think of a checksum like a digital fingerprint on a file. And we're going to generate these checksums when files are created, so we know how we started. And then we'll recreate them every single time that we either move or copy digital content, because that's when digital content is at its most vulnerable. So when you're either moving it or copying it, that's when files are most vulnerable. We also perform regular fixity checks on files, even if they aren't moved or copied. So we do this to ensure that none of the ones or zeros that make up the bits have changed by creating and validating checksums against the original hash value. So this sort of regular fixity checking should be done at a schedule that fits within your own organization's resources and infrastructure. So it is a relatively easy process, but it does take time, and it does take the human component to set this sort of thing up. And you can do some automated processes to help you with it, but it does still take time. It's still processor intensive to do, especially at scale, at large scale. So, at a minimum, consider doing this annually, but in an ideal world, we'll be doing this at a quarterly rate throughout the year. So we're going to look at an example, and when you look at that, you can see that when we're comparing the checksums from the past and the future, they match. We know that our content has integrity, and it's the same as it was now as when the checksum was originally generated. This tells us that the original file hasn't changed, or that the copied file is what we had copied it from, or that the full file moved and no bits were lost when we moved it from one location to another. We have ensured the fixity of this digital object. However, if we look at this example on the bottom, our checksums do not match. And we know that our digital content has changed for some reason, and we're going to have to investigate what happened. So we can use checks to detect if something has changed, but checksums won't tell us what has changed within the file. It will just tell us that something has changed. So what do you do if your checksums don't validate? Well, you go to a backup. And if I can get my slides to load, I can tell you about that. Okay, great. All right, so you go to your backup. Now, backup is a bit of a misnomer here, but in an ideal world, you would have multiple copies of your digital objects. And you may be familiar with the acronym LOCKSS, LOCKSS, which stands for Locks of Copies, Keeps Stuff Safe. And that's great. Lots of copies, more is better. But how many should you have? It depends. Like everything in this world, especially with digital preservation, it depends. 3 is good, 5 is better, 7 is considered ideal. But we all know that resources are limited, especially in smaller libraries and historical societies. So a good guiding principle is the 3-2-1 rule. So in the 3-2-1 rule, it states that you should have 3 copies of your files on 2 different storage media, one of which should be offsite. So having these 3 copies will enable you to restore files from a different storage location if there's been bit rot or other changes to the file. And if there is something that happened, it's unlikely that it would happen across all 3 copies. And it's even more unlikely that it would affect multiple copies. So depending on when and how they're stored, this should be sufficient for some basic digital preservation practices. But it's important to know that you'll want to distribute these across multiple storage media types. So this means that you should consider having files on a combination of removable hard drives, remote servers, cloud storage, cooperative networks, or more. So in this way, if there's an issue with one type of media, not all of your files will be affected, or it's less likely that all of your files will be affected. So I always like to consider the case of the archival gold quality CDs that were supposed to be the preservation storage media, about 20 years ago. And these CDs were supposed to have a lifespan of over 100 years, but now, less than 20 years later, we're looking and finding out that that is not the case, that that optical media is unstable, that these archival gold CDs are lasting only a fraction of the time. So if you had all of your files backed up to this one storage media, to these archival gold CDs, you may have lost all or a bulk of your content. So last thing, and I know Chelsea talked about this earlier in terms of some of the natural disasters that we're encountering, but you're going to want to geographically distribute your files, because if your building burns down, that's awful, but if you have a backup copy at your house, then you'll at least have that. But what if your whole region floods? What if, unfortunately, even today, there's a hurricane hitting Florida? What do you do when your entire region is in distress from natural disaster or wildfires or whatever it is particular to your region? That's why it's really important to have these sort of geographically distributed, whether it's across your state, across the country, maybe even internationally. Having this extra copy of your files will help to continue to provide an extra layer of preservation. So ultimately, all of these steps are just about reducing risk and amplifying redundancy. So a lot of digital preservation is about redundancy in the best sort of way. So even if you're able to digitally preserve your files as is forever, you'd likely still need to find ways of continuing to make them accessible over time. So we know that the reason that we digitally preserve files is to ensure that continued access to digital materials for as long as necessary. But as technology advances, we don't have the ability to access file types that are now obsolete. So one way that we can address this is through file migration. Migration is the process of moving a file from one file format to another, such as a Word document to a PDF. And this might occur if a file format is obsolete or no longer supported, and we wouldn't be able to open or use the file in its original format. And this is especially prevalent in audiovisual content where the carriers, like magnetic videotape, are now obsolete. We don't have the playback equipment to view this material, or the tapes themselves are deteriorating, and we'll want to migrate them to a new digital format. Over time, we'll continue to need to migrate to new file formats as current formats become obsolete. Now, one of the best ways to minimize migration or the need for migration is by choosing a long-lasting, sustainable file format. And ideally, we'll be selecting an open source or open adjacent file format with wide adoption. So luckily, we have a lot of guidance from experts in the field who have done comparative analysis of file formats and can provide that sort of guidance as we're choosing these formats. So first, the Library of Congress releases annually their recommended format statement, and this statement identifies hierarchies of physical and technical characteristics of created formats, both analog and digital, which will meet the needs of all concerned, maximizing the chances for survival and continued accessibility of creative content well into the future. So this is really helpful if we're both creating new files or if we're migrating from one file format to another more sustainable version or format. So you can also assess the sustainability of your current file formats by using the Library of Congress's Sustainability of Digital File Formats website. And this provides in-depth descriptions of over 400 formats, and they're sorted into categories like still image, sound, textual moving image, and more. What's really helpful about this site is that it includes relationships between file formats and factors to consider when you're evaluating, as well as recommended migration formats. So if you have this, it's recommended that you migrate to this other format in time. And then the last resource I'm going to mention is the federal agency's Digital Guidelines Initiative. It's also commonly known as FAGI. So FAGI is this collaborative effort of 20 federal agencies that articulate common sustainable practices and guidelines for digitized and born digital materials. So if you are digitizing materials, they will provide guidance on which file formats you should be digitizing. So it's really about how to create sustainable, long-lasting file formats without the need to constantly migrate over time. Okay. But migration won't always be an option. If you're migrating an obsolete file format that's just too complex, or maybe the process is just too expensive, an alternative to this is emulation. So emulation is the imitation of obsolete operating systems or software on newer generations of computers. So through emulation, you can recreate the functionality of the original software or technology by replicating their original digital or hardware environment. So a really common example that you're probably already familiar with is video games. And video games rely on very complex digital environments in order to interact with them, that it's just not just possible, or if it is, it's very complex and expensive to recreate those in a newer sustainable format. So what video game players or companies do are they will create emulators where you can play it and it feels like that, even though the software is actually newer software. It just feels like you're playing that. You might be able to just use operating system emulators. So if you have a WordPerfect document that needed to be opened in an earlier operating system environment, you can do that. There are emulators for that. Or things like CAD files. Specific CAD files are just too complex to migrate to the newer CAD version. So, you know, there's a wide variety of emulators, and they're their own sort of beast, because then they will eventually also need to be maintained over time. But, you know, depending on what you have, this might be a good option for right now. So that's all I'm going to talk about today, but I'd like to do an activity. So I'd like to invite you all to do this activity with me. If Becky can drop in the chat the link to this, but if you want to open up your browser to this file checksum generator, if you're using Chrome or Firefox, that's better. I'm not sure its functionality in some of the other browsers, but once you open it up, you'll see that there's several checkboxes that you can select. So there'll be an MD5 and a SHA-1, SHA-256. You can leave the others checked, but I definitely want you to check the MD5 option. So once that's checked, if you just open up any file on your computer, you can drag and drop it there. It's not going to upload it. It's not going to do anything to the file except create a checksum for it. So if you have access to a file either on your desktop or just on your computer, and you can do that, drag and drop it to where it says drop files, or click here to select. You can also, I think there's a browse button in there if you want to use that instead. So once you've gone ahead and done that, it will, depending on which options you have selected, it will generate checksums in those various algorithms. So I don't know if people have had a chance to do that yet. I'll give it a second. Feel free to, put in the chat if you're following along. I'll give it just another minute, because we're gonna then go and we're gonna open up this other checksum generator. So Becky has also dropped in, it's through GitHub, it's another checksum generator. So once you've created an MD5 using the original calculator, you can go to that second website. You can open up either a separate browser window or a separate browser tab and open this up, because we're going to be comparing your checksums generated in both of those. So if you open up the one on GitHub, it'll be the same thing. You'll drag and drop it where it says drop the file here in that tool, and see what happens. So has anyone done it? Does anybody want to drop in the chat? Do you have you got checksums showing, and are they the same? Chelsea did it. Chelsea got the same for both. Good job, Chelsea. Brendan, yes, that's speedy even for big files. Yes. Janet got the same for both. That's great. That is great. That's what it should be. That's very good. And you'll see it really doesn't take all that much time. And so now you at least have a starting point for those files. You know what that is. Oh, great. I'm really proud that you all were able to do this and see that it is something that can be done fairly simply. And there are many, many tools out there for generating checksums, so you can do it individually like this. Some of them are things that you can do in bulk. You can drop a file in, or you can drop a folder in, you can drop, there's lots and lots of different tools. Now, we're not going to get it too much into this, but something to consider is, what do you think would happen if you changed the file name and then you tried it again? Some of you might even want to try it if you are able to with the file that you put in. You could try just, adding a 1 or a letter or anything to the file name and try it again and see, do you think it'll be the same? Or do you think that it's going to change? Does anyone want to venture a guess? Chelsea, I think it would be the same. And
It's a different Chelsea, by the way.
It is. Oh,
Chelsea? There's 2 of us here. Chelsea Power.
Okay, well, Chelsea is correct. It would be the same. The file name is actually completely independent of the bit stream of the file itself. The file name belongs to basically the computer system, and that's how it finds the file, but it's independent. So you can change the file name without having to regenerate a checksum, which is really helpful in digital preservation, because a lot of times you'll have a file that you want to preserve, but you'll want to change how it's described in the file name because maybe it changed collections, or you got new metadata, so you're going to change the date that's in the file name or any of that sort of stuff, but the essence of the file itself is going to stay the same. So yes, no, oops, just great. This is what we're thinking about. We're learning about how files behave. And so I'm so proud that you were all able to do this, and you could see that it's something that's relatively simple and quick to do. So, you could always just, if there's something you wanted to start with, even something really small today, you could generate checksums and track them somewhere. You could track them in a Word document, you could track them in a spreadsheet, you could track them in a CSV file, anything. So that's one step that each one of you could take today to digitally preserve some of the files in your collection. So thank you all for doing that. All right, well, with that, once I get here, I am going to hand things back over to Chelsea to talk about tools and resources.
Excellent. Thank you so much, Biz. So if we've learned anything over these past 2 sections, we've learned that digital preservation is complex and requires lots of layers of knowledge to make some challenging decisions about our digital content. And it can seem really overwhelming and daunting, but luckily there are many tools, resources, and communities to help make that process less daunting. And so I'll be sharing just some of those today. This is but a wee fraction of the tools and communities that exist out there. So if I don't address something for an action that you might have questions about, do feel free to ask me at the end. And I can probably recommend at least 3 tools for the thing that you're asking about. So let's get started. So the next slide is we'll be talking about the DPC RAM. Haha, just kidding. It's not really RAMs. It's, next slide, a spreadsheet. Sorry, I just always like to make a nice little RAM joke because I love those little RAMs. That's like the little logo that they always include for all of the rapid assessment model branding. So the Digital Preservation Coalition Rapid Assessment Model is one of 2 tools we'll talk about today that are focused on benchmarking and assessment. If your organization is just starting out thinking about digital preservation, RAM is an excellent place to start. So the RAM is organized in a spreadsheet that features 2 sections, organizational capabilities and service capabilities, with 11 different criteria to evaluate. Each criteria is assessed on a level from 0 to 4, 4 being optimal, 0 indicating minimal awareness. And one important note about conducting a digital preservation assessment at your organization, and I do a whole presentation just on this. So if you're interested in this, let me know. Maybe it can be a future webinar, Biz. The best thing I can say about doing a digital preservation assessment at your organization is to be honest about your evaluation and not to feel guilty or get caught up in not scoring 4s across the board, right? You may find that you score a 4 in some categories and a 0 in others, and that's okay. This helps you identify the areas for focus that you want to improve on. So of the 2 benchmarking and assessment tools we'll discuss today, the DPC RAM is slightly more robust in that it takes into account the human and the institutional or technical elements of digital preservation together, right? One of the things that we talked about in our beginning definition is that series of managed activities, right? That digital preservation is a constant process, but you need people to do that process, not just tools. And so the DPC RAM is great in that sense. It's also great if your brain just tends to work better with spreadsheets. It's also great, Biz, if you want to go to the next slide, in that it allows you to visualize your results in a different way, such as this chart here, which can be really useful in condensing information into an easily digestible figure, which can then be used for advocacy purposes in your organization or communicating any needs to supervisors or IT staff. On the cons side, the really robust nature of the RAM and its many categories can seem a little overwhelming for a beginner. And so sometimes if there's an organization that's just starting out with benchmarking, I'll tend to push them towards the next tool. So if we want to go to the next slide. So the other benchmarking and assessment tool I'll recommend is the NDSA levels of digital preservation. And like I said, I tend to recommend the levels for beginners because it is a little more lightweight than DPC RAM. It's really easy to understand and navigate. The color-coded matrix setup is great if you are more of a visual person. But on the con side, the levels is really focused mostly on the technical aspects of digital preservation and less so on your organization's capacity to do digital preservation or on your staff skills or knowledge. So if we want to go to the next slide. And I should say, links to all of these resources are in the last slide. So if you're like, wait, what was that? Do not worry, you will have it all at the end. So our next resource is the DPC Handbook. The Digital Preservation Coalition's Handbook is one of the most thorough and complete resources related to digital preservation practice and planning. It features sections about technical aspects, as well as those more people-focused aspects that we've discussed during this presentation, like advocacy and consensus building. Each section begins with an informational entry, followed by some helpful resources, which if you go to the next slide, Biz, is broken down into publications, tools, web resources, video, and case studies, and then lastly, a references section. And so if you go to the next slide, we can see in this entry that there are some publications. There's also a tool, which is really exciting. Then if you go to the next one, you'll also see that there's some web resources and some case studies. And so each article has really robust information that you can pull from as you're investigating a particular issue. All right, so let's go on to the next slide. So Pronom is perhaps the most robust and complete online registry of technical information about file formats, software, and other technical components required to support long-term access to electronic records. It's managed and maintained by the National Archives in the UK. And you can see it's just a simple search that you can just search for any file format extension. You can see in this example, I've simply done a search for .doc. And you can see that there are many different versions of this one very common file extension. And I will say that the Pronom team is always looking for information about previously unreported file types and different versions within those file types. So if you come across something in your collections that you can't identify through a quick Pronom search, I do encourage you to report it using the submission form that I have dropped in the resources page at the end of this presentation. So this Pronom is a great, really rich and robust database. If you're looking through your collections and you're like, .evy. I have no idea what that is. Pronom will be able to tell you what it is, and then you can figure out how to best preserve it. And you can also do this using the tool that is on the next slide. So Droid. Droid is a software tool developed by the National Archive to perform automated batch identification of file formats. So it uses Pronom as its backend database and can analyze entire collections of files and generate useful reports about file types and sizes. Droid is very useful for better understanding what you have in the early stages of a digital collections management project, but it can also help you better understand what sorts of actions like migration or emulation you might need to take to maintain access to your files. And one of the things that we at the MDPN recommend is to actually put a Droid report in a preservation package so that you have some really rich information about the file types that are in those packages. So Droid it's free to use, free to download. It's a resource that I really recommend. But if we go to the next slide, this is actually an activity that I really wanted to do. I think it's very fun. And so I encourage you all to, at the end of this presentation, get on over to Siegfried. If you don't need to analyze an entire collection's worth of files, but you might have a question about one or two files that maybe just aren't rendering right or opening correctly, Siegfried is a wonderful, easy to use file format analyzer. It also relies on Pronom as its backend database, but also draws from the Library of Congress's database that Biz mentioned earlier. All you have to do is drag and drop, again, your file onto Siegfried's Anvil, and it will analyze it and tell you what sort of file it is. And you'll see in this example, a very useful bit of information that Siegfried can tell you. You'll see that it circled here that it has given me a warning extension mismatch. That's because the file that I dropped was labeled as a .txt file, and I changed it intentionally, but it was actually a JPEG file. And Siegfried knows this because it reads that file's internal file format signature rather than its external signature. So this is a very useful tool. Like I said, if you're having trouble opening or rendering a file, it could be because the file format signature was changed either accidentally or intentionally by someone else in the past. All right, on to the next one. EASY. So EASY stands for Emulation as a Service Infrastructure. And it's a project that seeks to make emulation easy and free for anyone, even if you don't have robust technical skills. Emulation as a service simplifies the use of emulation software by providing browser-based access to computing environments supported by various emulators. You don't need to know how to configure the emulator. Instead, you choose a few key components: machine type, operating system, software, the types of files you want to interact with. And then the EASY system boots the whole thing up for you. EASY is a great tool to explore if you have obsolete file types that won't open or render on your current operating systems, or that require obsolete or unsupported software. And we see here in the screenshot that there's many different environments available to choose from. And if we go to the next one, you'll see here within my browser screen, my selected environment booting up for me. And then into the next one, you'll see that the system is booted and mounted on just my regular old internet browser. And I can navigate to the very important reason why I am here in the next slide, to play Mahjong. Let's be real. That's really why I want to use an emulator. All right, and on to the next one. COW, or community-owned workflows. COW is actually a subsection of a tool that I'll be talking about after this. COW is an aggregator for different kinds of digital collections or digital preservation workflows developed and refined by very smart professionals who then share the work that they've done to take different actions on different file types using different systems And it's a great way to learn how to perform certain actions if you have questions about what steps to take in what order. So I definitely recommend investigating how. And on to the next one. Copter, or the Community-Owned Preservation Tools Registry, is a database of preservation tools created and maintained by community members and its users. It features currently 568 tools. I promise you will not need to use all of them. And then as we see here in the tools grid section, it allows you to locate the appropriate tool for your needs, either by content type on the left there, or by what sorts of actions you want to perform on the top there. And all of the tools in Copter have been vetted and reviewed by community members and are considered trusted. Some are free and open source. Others do require you to have a one-time fee, or do require a one-time fee or a sort of ongoing subscription for their continued use. So I would definitely recommend investigating some time and some tools in Copter. And then on to the next one, Biz, the MDPN. We are also a tool and a community and a service. MDPN is a membership-based collaborative initiative that provides access to affordable and easy-to-use digital preservation services. We serve museums, archives, libraries, historical societies, and all other sorts of cultural memory or collecting institutions of all sizes and resource levels across the state. Our membership levels are based on your annual operating budget. And so that allows us to offer equity-based membership pricing. And we also use the self-repairing locks software. I know Biz earlier used the term locks, means lots of copies keeps stuff safe. And I do a whole hour-long presentation on locks and how it keeps stuff safe, which we do not have time for. But if you are interested in how locks works, I'm happy to talk to you about it. And we also use a tool called Dart to make preservation easier and faster. And from that, I will leave it to Biz. On the next slide, there we go.
Great. Okay, thank you so much, Chelsea. Just kind of going over our key takeaways. Digital preservation protects digitized and born digital content from many different risks, from obsolescence to natural disasters. Digital preservation is an ongoing process of maintenance. It's not a one-off. I know Chelsea always likes to quote Trevor Owen saying that nothing is ever digitally preserved, it is being preserved. And I just love that so much because it's not something you check off, it's something that you work on constantly. And I think probably the most important thing to take away from this is that you're not alone. There are so many great tools and resources and communities out there to help with digital preservation because it is so vast and seemingly overwhelming. But there are definitely concrete steps that you can take in your collections to work towards continuing to digitally preserve your material. So I'd like to open it up, if I can move to the next slide, to questions. So what questions do you have for me or Chelsea or us or each other about how you're digitally preserving your material or how you'd like to be, anything like that? So feel free to either drop your questions in the chat or unmute yourselves. We'd love to have this discussion. I know we're running a little bit long today, but I know I'm happy to stick around and answer questions that you may have. So Christopher asked earlier, bit rot over time. What is the time interval? How often should data warehouses be replicated beyond daily maintenance? Yearly or decades? So I think what you're asking is how often should maybe things be moved to new storage media? Is that what you're asking? Or is if it's what you're asking, I mean, really kind of as often as necessary based on your type of storage media. So hard drives last about 3 to 5 years, depending on the quality or type of hard drive. That is an estimate. It does not apply across the board. There's other storage media like magnetic tape, like LTO tapes or LTFS tapes that have longer lifespans, but you're going to want to migrate those to newer tapes based on generations, because those types of things come out generationally. So about, I think the general rule is every 2 generations you migrate, because that way they're at least that way backwards compatible. Chelsea, I'll invite you to, add in.
Oh, sure. Yeah, I guess I also wanted some clarification on Christopher's question, because I actually thought it's interesting that you thought about the storage medium, because I actually thought that he was asking about how often should you be checking your fixity, which you addressed very well, by the way. Yeah, so maybe we have answered Christopher's question, maybe we have not.
Well,
no, maybe it's neither.
Yeah, okay.
Hi, Christopher.
So I'll jump in and clarify.
Yeah, please.
I was referring, you said, they decay over time. Well, I've got 1 million files because I've been really busy in my digital gathering of stuff. How often do I need to go through and duplicate these or make sure that everything is working just fine?
Yeah.
How long does it take before they depreciate under normal circumstances?
Right.
Much like you're looking at the gold DVD CDs as only lasting 10 years, then how long can we expect files to last on a hard drive before they're giving us a hard time?
Yeah, gosh, it's one of those things, and I'm sure this is the answer that everyone hates, is like, it depends, right? It depends on the media, it depends on the hard drive itself, it depends on the file size, and that's why instead of replicating files over and over again, right, and moving them and replicating them and moving them, which is really resource intensive. One of the things that we talk a lot about in the digital preservation community right now is sustainability, right? Are we contributing substantially to global warming by continuing to replicate and having 7 copies of things, even though it's the best practice? No. And so that's why we, instead of replicating content, recommend checking the fixity of that one piece of content over time, if that makes any sense.
Well, assuming you can do all your own disk recovery, I mean,
Yes.
the price of sending a drive that crashed off to get all the data recovered off of it is also rather prohibitive. And this may sound a little sarcastic, but when I listen to all this in its entirety, and then I look around me with my many LPs, I feel like, getting a vinyl press and just putting it all on vinyl records, because I've got, shellacked 78s that are good for 100 years and I can still get the data off, right?
Well, it's so, and I see Biz cringing a little bit there, and I'll let her address that, but it reminds me, I was just in Ireland on holiday, and I was sitting next to a gentleman who works for the Irish government in the Department of Justice, and he said, we still recommend that we migrate all of our content to microfiche because it's the only stable format. We don't have a cloud storage. We're the Department of Justice. And I'm sitting there thinking, that's interesting. I didn't fight with him too much on it, but it's funny to me that you're like, these analog formats last physically longer and aren't prone to something like bit rot. But if I take your vinyl record and I smash it, it's gone. So in that sense, it is more delicate. So anyway, Biz, I saw you cringing a little bit.
No, like, shellac being highly susceptible to humidity and all those sorts of things. No, I know you're right. Oh, you're right. Like, it is time intensive. It is resource intensive. These aren't things that, I'm definitely not recommending that you spend the resources to have 7 copies of things because it's not feasible. It's just not. Like, it's not feasible in large institutions. It's definitely not feasible in, public, like smaller public libraries. It's not going to be. So that's why it's really a balance of finding what is ideal and what is possible. And so really, like if you have a copy of your preservation files on a hard drive and you have a copy of them stored in the cloud, you know, you're checking off a lot of those boxes. You've got it on a couple different storage media, geographically distributed. And that's something that you could, okay, you're going to plug this hard drive in once a year and run Fixity check on it and see. And if everything still validates, then you can put that back on the shelf, because these aren't the files that you're going to be interacting with on a daily or a regular basis. These are your preservation files. These are files that are the highest quality, largest content. These aren't the things you're accessing every day. So by taking these extra precautions, which it is time intensive, but by taking these extra precautions, you can make sure that the access copies that you're using are things that your patrons and that your users will be able to continue to access over time. And a lot of these access formats are not as sustainable. That's why we're, you know, aside from compression and those sorts of things, they're usually, as software interfaces change more frequently, they're not going to be the file formats that you're keeping. They're going to be the ones that are changing. You're making new access files and new file versions and new file formats to keep up with access requirements. So in an ideal world, you're putting your 3 copies in various places and you're really not touching them often except for fixity checks or migrating them over time. Yep. So in terms of like how often should you be kind of doing that, like you can never tell bit rot. So bit rot is, these are ones and zeros that are electromagnetically charged into either that 1 or that 0. Yep. So who knows why things spontaneously change? Like maybe, that's why you keep magnets away from computers, but you never know what could cause it. Like literally bits will spontaneously change from a 1 to a 0. We can't tell that. But what we can do is have another copy that we can use to restore those 1s and 0s if that does happen. So I hope that answers the question. And also, I will say, I am at a conference right now presenting, and I just had a tour of another state library and archive where they are still microfilming newspapers. They're microfilming them because that is what they use. And microfilm is very sustainable. Whether or not you can access the playback equipment for them is a question, but they have a digital interface, but they are microfilming newspapers, and then they have a digital interface to access that microfilm. So yes, there are very sustainable analog formats. Film, motion picture film is the preservation file format for that media type. So yes, there's definitely an analog component where, nothing, I don't think everything's going to be safe forever, but we'll do our best. And
but I think,
go ahead.
I think, Biz, right, we make digital formats so that they can be more accessible to a broader public, right? And I think, sure, you can have something on film, but you have to come to now your museum and put it on a film reader and watch it there in the place. And so, that's, I think, the push and the pull of keeping stuff safe, right, is a preservation format that is safe and lasts a long time versus making digital copies to then make access copies, right? I also really appreciated go ahead.
No, I was just going to say, Brandon put in a question, but if you want to finish your thought.
Oh, no, I was just, one of my favorite comparisons to make is like the hands in the cookie jar, right? You should always have a preservation cookie jar and an access cookie jar, and all of the grubby little kids can stick their hands in the access cookie jar and pull things out. I want that. I want this. Your preservation cookie jar, it gets opened once a year, right? It must be like really disgusting biscotti in there or something. But, right, that preservation cookie jar is not for general consumption. So that's kind of one of the little metaphors I like to use for your preservation copy and your access copy.
On behalf of biscotti, I take umbrage with that, but otherwise, yes, that's a great
Christmas stolen works.
Yes.
Thank you. All right, so Brendan asks, how do you handle hash checks for massive digital collections? Are you scripting this out with an MD5 command line tools, or is there a friendly Fixity interface?
So there's a lot of different Fixity tools out there. My favorite is unfortunately one that does cost money. It's called Fixity Pro. It's created and managed by AVP. It's a great tool. Some other good free tools out there. There are some. I know the DPC Handbook recommends Checksum by cores. So if you go into the Digital Preservation Coalition's handbook, you should be able to find that, I think, in their like tools and demo section. I have never used cores, so I can't speak to it myself. One that our sister network, Chronopolis, based in California, uses is called ACE, Audit Control Environment. I also have never used it personally, but it is created and managed by a very large community-run digital preservation network. So I tend to think that that one is also trustworthy. Yeah, there's a lot of different Fixity tools out there. We don't use one because we use Locks software, which is self-repairing and self-healing. And so we don't actively run Fixity checks every 90 days. We can do them on command, but otherwise the system does them at random. So does that answer your question, Brendan? Okay, cool. And if you want, I do know someone within our network who currently does Fixity checking of their own files by hand. And it is, yep, I see business face. Like it is a long process. But they do it. And so I'm happy to connect you to that person as well.
Yeah, computers are really good at this sort of thing, so we should make them do this sort of hard work and save our brain cycles for things that humans are better at. So yes, I always like to make them, yes, hopefully it won't come to that.
Yes.
Well, I know we're a little bit over time, but if you have any questions, feel free to either drop them in the chat or unmute yourself. I'll give it another second. I know this is a lot, and digital preservation has a lot of components, but as you can also tell, this is what we really geek out about. So we love to talk about it and answer questions. But if you don't have any other questions, small one man for you. Digitize, share, preserve.
Whoa.
Where should my priority be?
I think I feel like this is the kind of question that makes enemies. Because of course I'm biased, right? I'm going to say preserve, but you also can't preserve without digitizing unless you're preserving born digital. But also, why do we digitize and preserve if not to promote access?
The three-legged stool, they're so intertwined. I would say that having one thing digitized, preserved, and accessible is better than having 100 things digitized.
Yeah.
So thinking about it holistically.
Yeah. And I will say a good way to approach that kind of question is being very militant about your selection and appraisal, right? You should have a priority list of the items that you find the most useful for or that your public or your community asks for the most, and you should prioritize those for digitization and access and then preservation, right? So one small chunk at a time.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and if you need help with that, you can go back and look at some of the earlier classes on scope and selection that can really help narrow your scope of where you're investing your resources, because it is a resource intensive process.
Right. And I also will, I'm not here to necessarily do a sales pitch or anything, but I will, right, advocate a little bit for the MDPN, because this is why we exist as an organization. We understand that most organizations do not have a dedicated digital preservation coordinator. Some lucky few do. And so the MDPN understands that many folks out there are already overwhelmed with the idea of digitizing and providing access. And so if we can take, I don't want to say ownership or control, because that's not what it is. If we can help facilitate digital preservation by making it as simple as dragging and dropping a file, then that's why, that's what we're trying to do. And that's why we exist. And we were just awarded a IMLS grant to make digital preservation be as easy as dragging and dropping files. And so we hope by the end of 2024, which seems like an awful long way away, but is I'm quickly approaching, but more likely in mid 2023, we should have that whole system up and running. So stay tuned, I guess.
Excuse me. Thank you, Chelsea. I got just one last poll for you to kind of guide our future programming for next year. Our digitization basic series is done, but I definitely want to hear your thoughts on what you'd like to see next. So for those of you who stuck around, thank you. This is multiple choice. You can select all, you can select none. Please feel free. Are you seeing the poll? Okay, good. All right, so, what kind of content would you like to see covered next? Do you want advanced digitization topics, like more of what we've covered in this series, but more in depth? Do you want sort of format specific classes? Like a lot of people are interested in getting their newspapers digitized. You want more help on that? Do you want to learn about working with digitization vendors and that process? You want to host a community scanning day, but you need to know how. You need resources for that. Creating digital exhibits. Would you like a hands-on digitization workshop that's like a whole day thing that takes you through the whole process? Or something else. If there's something else you want to see that's not on here or hasn't been talked about, feel free to drop it in the chat or send me a separate email and say that these are the types of resources I'd love to see, and I'll work to develop programming around those. So it looks like we've got some format specific classes, community scanning, and digital exhibits taking the lead, but it looks like I think a lot of people want to see just kind of in general more. And I hope that the people who did something else will drop what it is in the chat. And it looks like maybe they are. All right, that's it. That's it for today. I just want to say a huge thank you to Chelsea for joining us today and sharing her expertise and her time with our community. I also want to thank the Institute of Museum and Library Services for making this webinar series possible over the last 9 months. Here is our contact information, so feel free to send us an email or call us. We're happy to answer any of the questions that you may have. And otherwise, I will see you next year with some of these new classes that we're discussing. So thank you all for participating. And yes, you will get a copy of the slides, and this is the resources link. So you'll get a copy of this as well.
Wait,
Chelsea
before
has
we
something
go,
to say. Okay.
I do have something to say.
Yes.
One of the things that we did not cover, because it's a real Pandora's box, is storage, even though storage was in the title. Sorry. But I did drop in this resources list. The second to last resource is the preservation storage criteria. It is a series of 62 questions you should be asking of your storage or your storage provider.
That's a lot of questions.
It's a lot of questions.
It is a lot of questions.
I got questions.
Yeah. So thank you all. We really appreciate it, and have a wonderful Tuesday.